The night the old man stepped into the ring, the world seemed to pause for a single breathless moment, like even time itself wanted to watch what was about to unfold. In that cracked, sweat-stained gym that had seen 1,000 forgotten fights, a 74-year-old warrior stood with his chin lifted, his eyes calm, and every person in the room knew that something different was about to happen. This wasn't just an exhibition, it was a quiet revolution, a living testament that no matter how long the years had clawed at your bones, there was still power in the patient rhythm of breath and memory. When the bell rang, it wasn't just the echo of leather and canvas that filled the air. It was the thunder of every story that had ever ended with a man choosing to rise, to stand, to fight one last time. If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your own battles, or the moments you chose to stand back up when the world said you couldn't. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join us on more journeys of resilience, hope, and the quiet strength that lives in all of us. The afternoon sun dipped low over Iron Fist Boxing Club, its rays slanting through the dusty windows to catch the sweat-soaked glint of heavy bags swaying gently in their chains. The steady rhythm of gloves striking leather echoed through the air, a percussion of power and precision that marked this sanctuary of sweat and struggle. Young fighters moved like coiled springs, each punch a testament to the hunger that had brought them here. At the edge of this cacophony, the door swung open with the soft chime of an old brass bell. Heads turned, curiosity flickering in the eyes of those who had grown used to the same faces, the same drills, the same pecking order. And then, in stepped a figure wholly out of place. He was an old man, dark-skinned and thin, his back stooped beneath a worn tan coat that had seen better days. A battered flat cap shaded eyes that had learned to look beyond the immediate. In his left hand, he leaned heavily on a wooden cane, the polished handle worn to a soft sheen by decades of use. His name was Isaiah Thompson, though no one in Iron Fist Boxing Club knew that yet. All they saw was a relic of another time, a man whose trembling steps and measured breathing seemed to declare his age more loudly than any birth certificate could. Ethan and Cole, the self-styled kings of the ring, paused mid-conversation as they watched him shuffle forward. They exchanged smirks, their laughter a low rumble beneath the music that pulsed from the stereo in the corner. It wasn't every day that a 74-year-old man wandered into a place like this. They had seen all types here. Rookies trying to prove themselves, seasoned amateurs hungry for another shot at glory, street kids with too much anger and nowhere to put it. But this was different. This was novelty, a punchline wearing orthopedic shoes. Isaiah took in the gym with the eyes of a man who had spent his life searching for truths in places like this. The ring was elevated in the center of the floor, its white rope stained with sweat and ambition. Heavy bags hung in a row like sentinels of bruised leather, their battered surfaces a testament to every fighter who had come before. Posters of past champions adorned the walls, some known, some forgotten, their eyes frozen in sepia moments of triumph. The air smelled of leather, chalk, and the faint tang of disinfectant, a scent that had not changed in 50 years. Behind the reception desk, Erica glanced up from her clipboard. Her platinum blonde hair was tied back in a severe bun, her tailored tracksuit more suited to a yoga studio than a boxing gym. She raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing in her cool blue eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that was meant to keep distance rather than bridge it. Isaiah paused, adjusting his grip on the cane. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a quiet warmth, as if he were greeting an old friend he had not seen in decades. "I was hoping," he said, his voice soft but clear, "to inquire about joining your club." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. A young man at the speed bag lost his rhythm, the rapid staccato of leather on leather faltering. Ethan snorted, his smirk widening as he leaned back against the wall, arms folded across his chest. "Join?" he repeated under his breath, a note of disbelief lacing his words. Erica blinked, her brow furrowing as she tried to formulate a response that would be both diplomatic and dismissive. "Boxing is a physically demanding sport," she said carefully. "We cater to a very active clientele. Maybe you'd be more comfortable with something less intense." Isaiah regarded her calmly, as if she had not just offered him a polite rejection, but a puzzle to solve. "I appreciate your concern," he said, nodding slowly, "but I've spent enough years sitting. It's time I stood again." The conviction in his voice gave Erica pause. She hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at Coach Rick, who was wrapping the hands of a young fighter near the ring. Rick was in his mid-40s, his salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head, the sweat on his forehead a testament to the hours he'd already spent in this place today. His eyes, sharp and discerning, met hers for a fleeting moment before flicking back to the task at hand. "Let him sign up if he wants," he called out without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many fighters to judge one by age alone. "The ring sorts everyone out in the end." Erica pursed her lips but said nothing more. She pulled out a clipboard with a waiver form and pushed it across the counter. "Fill this out, please," she said, her tone clipped, "and I'll need to see some ID." Isaiah took the clipboard, his hand steady as he signed his name with a careful flourish. Isaiah Thompson, born 1949. His penmanship was neat, almost old-fashioned, each letter formed with deliberation. When he handed it back, Erica barely glanced at the date of birth before filing it away. She handed him a day pass, just one, her silent statement that this was not an invitation to stay, merely an allowance to try. As he took the card, Ethan's laughter echoed softly from across the room. "What's he gonna do? Shadowbox with the heavy bag?" he said, his words aimed more at Cole than at Isaiah, but loud enough to be sure they would sting. Cole snickered in agreement, the two of them feeding off each other's derision like hyenas around a carcass. Isaiah turned to them, his eyes meeting Ethan's for a moment. There was no challenge in his gaze, no flicker of wounded pride. Instead, there was an almost imperceptible smile, a soft curve of his lips that seemed to say, "We'll see." Then he turned away, his cane tapping lightly against the worn wooden floor as he walked toward the locker room. He moved slowly but with a dignity that did not waver. Each step was deliberate, measured. Behind him, the whispers grew. The old man. The fossil. What's he thinking? But Isaiah heard none of it, or if he did, he chose not to let it matter. He had heard far worse in his life than the laughter of young men. Inside the locker room, the air was damp and close. The metal lockers were dented from years of careless slamming, their doors adorned with stickers and scribbled names. Isaiah found an empty bench and sat down carefully, his breath coming slow and steady. He reached into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a pair of worn-out training shoes, their soles cracked from years of use. They had been with him in gyms long gone, in places where the language was foreign, but the rhythm of fists was always the same. He changed slowly, folding his coat and shirt with meticulous care before slipping into a plain white t-shirt and a pair of faded sweatpants. His skin, dark and lined, was a map of a life lived in the shadows of the ring. Scars traced stories across his forearms, thin white lines that caught the flickering light of the bare bulbs overhead. Each one had a memory, a lesson written in flesh and healed with time. He moved to the mirror and studied himself for a moment. The man who looked back was old, yes, but there was something beneath the wrinkles and the silver in his beard, something that spoke of steel forged in fire. He closed his eyes and took a breath, deep and centering, feeling the rhythm of his heart slow and steady. In that breath, he found the calm that had carried him through every storm. Outside, the sounds of the gym continued, a symphony of fists and feet, of ambition and pain. Isaiah stepped back into the noise, his shoes whispering across the concrete floor. He did not head straight for the ring, nor did he drift aimlessly. He moved with purpose, each step a statement. He paused near the heavy bags, his eyes tracing the path of a young man as he worked the bag with fierce, sloppy power. The youth's punches were wild, driven by muscle but lacking in rhythm. Isaiah watched for a moment, his head tilting slightly as he considered the boy's form. Then he turned away, moving to an empty corner of the gym where the floor was worn smooth by generations of feet. There, he dropped his cane and raised his fists. The room around him fell away. He began to move slowly, each motion deliberate and precise. A quiet kata of boxing, a conversation between his body and the ghosts of the past. His jabs were measured, his footwork subtle, his breath steady. He did not punch with the violence of youth, but with the wisdom of years, each movement a lesson learned the hard way. Ethan, leaning against the wall with Cole, watched with a smirk. "Look at him," he said, "dancing with shadows." But there was something in Ethan's eyes that betrayed his words, a flicker of uncertainty, of curiosity. He had seen the way the old man's shoulders rolled, the way his feet seemed to glide without lifting. It was not the clumsy shuffle of a pretender. It was something else, Isaiah finished his shadow boxing and stood for a moment, breathing deeply. His eyes drifted around the room, taking in the young men who had not yet learned what he had always known. That the ring was not just a place of violence, but of truth. That every punch was a question and every block an answer. That the true fight was not against the man in front of you, but the man inside you. He bent slowly to pick up his cane, his movements unhurried. He felt the eyes on him, some mocking, some merely curious. He did not look at them. He did not need to. He had not come here for their approval. He had come to remember what it felt like to stand in a place where only the honest survived. As he turned to walk toward the ring, Rick called out to him from the other side of the gym. "Isaiah," he said, the name rolling off his tongue as if it had always been known to him. "You ready for this?" Isaiah paused, then nodded once. "I was born ready," he said simply. The words carried no bravado, no false pride. They were spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone but himself. And as he stepped toward the ring, toward the place where truth lived and illusions died, the laughter of the young men fell away like autumn leaves in the wind. The ring was alive with the ghosts of every fighter who had ever stood within its ropes, and as Isaiah stepped through them, he felt each one brush against his skin, like the memory of a long-forgotten dream. The canvas beneath his feet was stained with the sweat of 1,000 battles, each mark a testament to the truth that had been fought for here. He touched the top rope lightly with his fingers, the frayed fabric warm beneath his calloused hand, and for a moment he closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he had ever climbed into a ring, a boy of 16 with fists like iron and a heart full of fire. The gym then had smelled the same, of sweat and leather and the faint electric tang of anticipation. He remembered the way his coach's voice had sounded in his ear. "Every step counts, Isaiah. Every breath. Don't waste a single one." He had carried those words with him ever since, a quiet mantra whispered to himself in every fight, every moment of doubt. Now, at 74, his body no longer moved with the effortless speed of youth. But each step he took was measured, each breath deliberate. As he moved to the center of the ring, he could feel the weight of every year, every mile he had walked since those first days. And yet, beneath the aches and the stiffness, there was still a spark, a flicker of the boy who had once believed that anything was possible if he could just keep fighting. Coach Rick watched from the edge of the ring, his expression carefully neutral. He had seen a lot in his years at Iron Fist, boys who thought they were men, men who thought they were gods. He had seen them rise and fall, each one convinced they would be the exception to the rule. But as he watched Isaiah move, something in the old man's quiet confidence gave him pause. "All right," Rick said, his voice low and even. "Let's see what you've got." Ethan and Cole leaned against the ropes, their laughter hushed now to a curious murmur. Maya stood a little apart, her brow furrowed in thought, her eyes following Isaiah's every movement with a mixture of wonder and worry. Isaiah squared his shoulders and raised his fists. They were wrapped in worn cloth hand wraps, the kind that spoke of years of use and careful maintenance. His hands trembled slightly, the tremor of age undeniable, but his eyes were steady. Rick stepped forward, his hands held loosely in front of him. "We'll keep it light," he said. "Just movement. Show me what you know." Isaiah nodded, the corners of his lips lifting in a faint smile. "Movement is the foundation," he said softly, as if reciting a prayer. The two men began to circle each other, their feet sliding across the canvas in a slow, deliberate dance. Isaiah moved with a grace that belied his years, each step a testament to the decades he had spent honing his craft. Rick, younger and stronger, tested him with gentle prods, short jabs, probing footwork. Isaiah answered not with speed, but with understanding, slipping just out of reach, his balance always centered. For a moment, the gym fell away. There was no music, no laughter, just the soft whisper of feet and the low sound of breath. It was the language of fighters, spoken without words, a conversation older than any of them. Rick's brow furrowed as he pressed forward, increasing the intensity just a fraction. He feinted left, then threw a light jab to the right. Isaiah didn't block so much as he simply wasn't there, his head turning, his shoulders rolling, the punch skimming past his cheek by a breath. Cole let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered, and for the first time, there was no mockery in his voice. Ethan scowled, his arms tightening across his chest. "It's just beginner's luck," he said. but his tone was uncertain, the bravado slipping around the edges. Rick stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" he asked, his voice low. Isaiah tilted his head, his expression mild. "From a lifetime of learning," he said, "and a lifetime of listening." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every round he had ever fought, every lesson he had learned the hard way. Rick nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Let's see the guard," Rick said. "High guard, chin tucked." Isaiah raised his fists, his elbows in tight, his chin lowered but his gaze sharp. It was a textbook stance, clean and economical. Rick stepped in, testing it with a light hook to the body. Isaiah shifted, his shoulder dropping just enough to absorb the impact without giving ground. They moved like that for several minutes, Rick probing, Isaiah adjusting. It wasn't a fight, not really, but it was something close, a testing of spirit, a measuring of souls. When Rick finally stepped back, he let out a slow breath, his eyes studying the old man with newfound interest. "Not bad," he said, his voice softer now. "Not bad at all." Isaiah nodded, lowering his guard. He was breathing hard, sweat glistening on his forehead, but there was a calm in his gaze that spoke of deeper reserves. Erica, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was a tightness around her mouth. "We're a professional gym," she said, her voice cool. "We have a certain image to maintain." Rick shot her a look. "He's not asking for a title shot, Erica. He's asking to train, that's all." Erica's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. She turned on her heel and walked away, the click of her heels sharp against the concrete floor. Isaiah watched her go, then turned back to Rick. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance." Rick shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "Everyone deserves a chance," he said, "but you better be ready to work." Isaiah's smile widened just a fraction. "I've been working my whole life," he said. Rick nodded, then gestured to the rest of the gym. "Find yourself a bag. Show me what you've got." Isaiah walked to the far corner of the gym, where an old heavy bag hung from a thick chain bolted to the ceiling. The leather was cracked, the surface scarred by years of punishment. He placed his cane carefully against the wall, then raised his fists once more. He began slowly, each punch a study in control. His jabs were sharp, his cross tight and economical. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, just the quiet precision of a man who had spent a lifetime in love with the art of striking. Each blow landed with a muted thud, the bag swaying gently beneath the weight of his intent. As he worked, the rest of the gym seemed to fall away. The laughter of Ethan and Cole faded to a distant murmur. The music that thumped through the speakers became nothing more than a faint echo. All that remained was the rhythm of his breath, the soft hiss of exhalation with each punch. Maya watched from across the room, her eyes wide. She had seen plenty of fighters, some fierce, some reckless, but there was something different in the way Isaiah moved. It was as if he were dancing not with the bag, but with his memories, each punch a note in a song only he could hear. Rick watched too, his arms folded across his chest. There was a part of him that still didn't understand this old man, didn't know why he had come here, what he hoped to find. But as he watched the steady, deliberate movements, he found himself thinking of his own beginnings, of the first time he had ever wrapped his hands and stepped into the ring, of the way it had felt to throw a punch and feel the world sharpen around him. After several minutes, Isaiah stepped back, his breath coming in slow, measured gasps. He picked up his cane and leaned on it lightly, turning back to Rick with a small nod. "That's enough for today," Rick said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Come back tomorrow if you want." Isaiah smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I will," he said. "Thank you." He turned and made his way back to the locker room, the quiet dignity of his movements at odds with the fatigue that lined his face. As he passed Ethan and Cole, their laughter had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. They watched him go, their expressions a mix of confusion and something else, something they didn't yet have words for. Maya, her gloves still hanging around her neck, took a step forward. "That was amazing," she said softly. Isaiah paused, his hand on the doorframe, and looked back at her. His eyes were kind, his smile gentle. "It's not about being amazing," he said. "It's about being honest. The ring doesn't care about anything else." And with that, he stepped through the doorway, leaving behind a silence that was somehow heavier than any punch dot. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning that seemed to hang heavy over the city like a wet coat. Isaiah woke early, as he always did, the habit of decades that refused to be broken by the passage of years. He dressed slowly, the stiffness in his joints a familiar ache that he greeted like an old friend. As he tied the laces of his worn sneakers, he paused for a moment, breathing deep and feeling the quiet pulse of the day ahead. The Iron Fist Boxing Club was already alive when he arrived, the thump of gloves against heavy bags echoing through the cavernous space. The smell of sweat and leather wrapped around him like a second skin, and for a moment, he closed his eyes and let it wash over him. It was the same smell he had known as a boy, the same scent that had been his constant companion through every fight, every victory, every defeat. Maya was there, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked the double-end bag. Her rhythm was off, her strikes too tense, too eager. Isaiah watched her for a moment before stepping closer. "Relax your shoulders," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the music blaring from the stereo. "You're fighting yourself, not the bag." She paused, turning to look at him. "I know," she said, her frustration evident. I keep thinking about what people say, about what I'm supposed to be." Isaiah tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "Boxing doesn't care about what people say," he told her. "It only cares about what you give to it. Everything else is just noise." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I'll try," she said. "That's all any of us can do," Isaiah replied. Across the gym, Ethan and Cole watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. They had seen how Maya's attention had shifted, how the respect in her eyes had begun to grow for the old man, who moved like a whisper and spoke like a teacher. It unsettled them in a way they couldn't quite name. "What do you think he's trying to prove?" Ethan asked, his tone low and biting. Cole shrugged, his eyes fixed on Isaiah. "Maybe he thinks he's still got it," he said. "Maybe he's just another old man trying to chase the past." But even as he spoke, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. He had seen the way Isaiah moved, the way he slipped punches that never even touched him. It was something he couldn't explain, and it gnawed at him like a loose tooth. Rick watched from the edge of the ring, his arms folded across his chest. He had seen fighters like Ethan and Cole before, young men convinced that power was everything, that speed and aggression were all they needed. He had tried to teach them that there was more to boxing than violence, but they had never really listened. Now, as he watched Isaiah work, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, they would finally start to see. "Isaiah," he called out, beckoning the old man over. "Let's work some footwork today. Show the kids how it's done." Isaiah nodded, his smile faint but warm. He stepped into the ring without hesitation, his movements slow but sure. Rick led him through drills, pivots, slides, shifts of weight that turned defense into offense and offense into art. The young fighters watched, some with amusement, some with something closer to awe. "See how he stays balanced," Rick said, his voice calm and even. "That's what keeps you standing when the punches come. That's what keeps you breathing." Isaiah moved with a fluidity that belied his age, each step a quiet testament to the years he had spent perfecting this dance. He didn't try to be fast. He didn't try to be powerful. He just moved, and in his movement there was a kind of quiet poetry that spoke to something deeper than the ring. Maya watched from the edge of the ring, her hands gripping the ropes. She saw the way Isaiah's feet barely left the canvas, the way his shoulders turned just enough to let the world slip past. She saw the way he carried himself, not with the swagger of youth, but with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Why does he do it?" she asked Rick softly as he stepped down from the ring. Rick glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because he loves it," he said simply, "and because he knows that the ring is the only place where you can be completely honest. No lies, no excuses, just you and the truth." As Isaiah stepped out of the ring, Ethan caught his eye. "Not bad for an old man," he said, his tone mocking but his eyes uncertain. Isaiah just smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Age teaches you things that youth can't," he said. "You'll learn that one day." Ethan scowled, but he didn't have a comeback. He turned away, his fists clenching at his sides. Later that day, as the gym began to empty out and the sun sank low in the sky, Isaiah stayed behind. He moved to the heavy bag again, his punches slow and deliberate. Each strike was measured, each breath a quiet prayer. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just listening, to the rhythm of his heart, to the memory of every fight he had ever fought. Rick watched from the office doorway, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Erica stood beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "He's gonna hurt himself," she said, her voice cold. "We're not running a retirement home." Rick didn't answer right away. He watched Isaiah's steady rhythm, the way he moved with the quiet surety of a man who had nothing left to prove. "He's not here to hurt anyone," he said finally. "He's here to remind us what this place is supposed to be about." Erica snorted, turning away. "Whatever. If he gets hurt, it's on you." Rick didn't argue. He just watched Isaiah, the old man's silhouette framed by the fading light. He didn't know what Isaiah's story was, where he had come from, what had brought him back to the ring after all these years. But he knew this much. In a world that measured worth in knockouts and title belts, Isaiah was something different, something true. And as he watched, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or faith. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars of the evening began to emerge, cold and bright in the darkening sky. Inside the gym, the old man kept punching. Slow, steady, each blow a promise to himself that he was still here, still fighting, still alive. That night, after the last light in the gym flickered out and the city fell into the hush of midnight, Isaiah walked slowly along the cracked sidewalks of the neighborhood, his cane tapping a quiet rhythm that echoed in the darkness like a heartbeat against the silence. And though his body was tired, every step felt like a small victory, a testament to the quiet defiance that had brought him back to the ring. He paused in front of the shuttered window of a small diner, the neon sign flickering above him, casting a sickly glow across the cracked pavement. And he could see his reflection in the glass, a shadow of a man who had once been feared and revered in equal measure, and he allowed himself a small, wry smile, the kind that comes from knowing that the only person you truly have to prove anything to is yourself. As he moved again, his thoughts drifted to the gym, to the young fighters whose laughter had turned to questions, to the way Maya had looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes, and he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, the warmth of purpose, of belonging, even if only for a moment. At home, he undressed slowly, folding his clothes with the same careful precision he brought to the ring, and when he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, he studied the lines in his face, the map of every mile he had walked, every punch he had taken, every moment he had refused to yield. He traced the faint scar that curved along his cheekbone, a memento of a long-ago fight in a basement ring in Detroit, and he remembered the sound of the crowd that night, the roar of it, the way it had felt like the world had been holding its breath just for him. He slept that night in fits and starts, his dreams a jumble of memories and half-forgotten battles, of nights when he was young and his fists had been the only language he spoke, and when dawn came, he rose with a quiet resolve, his body aching but his spirit sharp. At the gym, Rick was already there, his brow furrowed as he taped the ropes of the ring, and when Isaiah walked in, he nodded once, a silent greeting that spoke of respect. Erica, on the other hand, watched him with cool detachment, her arms folded as if to shield herself from the crackling energy that seemed to fill the gym whenever Isaiah stepped onto the mat. The day's training began as it always did, the young fighters pushing themselves with a kind of desperate intensity that Isaiah recognized all too well, and he watched them carefully, his eyes missing nothing. The sloppy footwork, the wasted motion, the places where fear had not yet learned to hide itself behind bravado. When it was his turn to work, he moved to the heavy bag, his hands steady, his breathing calm, and he began the slow dance of fists and feet that had carried him through every storm life had ever thrown his way. Each punch, a meditation. Each slip, a prayer. Ethan and Cole watched from the sidelines, their laughter gone, replaced by something else, something that neither of them could name, but both of them felt like a weight pressing down on their chests. Maya joined him after her own drills, her eyes bright with questions, and he showed her the small things. The turn of the hip that made a punch land with purpose instead of anger, the way to breathe so that the lungs became allies rather than enemies. And in those quiet moments, the gym seemed to transform, the walls no longer just sweat-stained concrete, but something closer to a temple, a place where the past and the present could meet and shake hands as the hours wore on and the sun dipped low again. Rick approached him, his expression thoughtful, and said, "I've been thinking about putting you on the roster for an exhibition match, just a few rounds, nothing serious." And Isaiah looked at him, his dark eyes steady, and said, "There's no such thing as nothing serious in the ring. But there was no anger in his voice, only the calm acceptance of a man who knew the truth of that statement better than anyone. The idea took root in the gym that day, spreading in whispers and curious glances, and though Erica frowned at the mention of it, the rest of the fighters couldn't help but be drawn to the idea of watching the old man step back into the ring to see if the years had truly dulled his edge or only refined it. As he left that evening, the cold wind biting at his face, Isaiah felt a quiet thrill in his chest. Not fear, not dread, but the electric anticipation of the moment when the bell would ring and everything else would fall away, leaving only the man and the fight. The truth and the question of whether the answer had ever really changed. The following day, the Air and Iron Fist Boxing Club was heavy with expectation. The usual banter between fighters replaced by a hushed curiosity that crackled like static in the corners of the ring, and when Isaiah stepped through the door, every eye turned to him, the whispers halting as if the room itself was holding its breath, and he felt the weight of those gazes, the questions they didn't dare to ask out loud. But he did not falter. Instead, he moved with that same quiet dignity, his cane tapping out a steady beat on the worn wooden floor, each step a promise that he was exactly where he belonged. Rick met him at the edge of the ring, his expression thoughtful, a clipboard in hand that he tapped against his thigh as he spoke in a low voice that carried authority without arrogance. The exhibition match is set for next Friday. 3 rounds, light contact, just to show the community what the old ways look like. And Isaiah nodded once, his dark eyes calm and unafraid. Light contact is still contact, Rick, he said with a faint smile, and the coach let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in agreement. Across the gym, Ethan and Cole watched from the weight bench, their usual smirks replaced by furrowed brows, the seed of doubt that Isaiah had planted growing roots they hadn't expected. And while Cole's jaw tightened with something like respect, Ethan's eyes were dark, restless, the need to prove himself gnawing at the edges of his composure. Maya drifted closer, her water bottle forgotten in her hand. "Will you really do it?" she asked softly, her voice a mix of worry and wonder. And Isaiah looked at her with a warmth that seemed to cut through the chill of the drafty old gym. "The fight never leaves you, Maya," he said. "Even when you think it's gone, it's just waiting for you to remember who you are." And those words settled in her chest like a challenge and a comfort all at once. Training began as it always did, the heavy bags taking the rhythm of a dozen fists, the skipping ropes slapping the floor like a chorus of rain. But today the air was different, charged with the knowledge that the past was not dead, that it had simply been waiting for its moment to step back into the light. Isaiah worked alone in the corner, his movements slow and deliberate, his breathing deep and steady, each punch a study in purpose rather than power. And though the young fighters watched him with skeptical eyes, they could not deny the economy of his motion, the way he wasted nothing, the way he seemed to flow rather than fight. Rick, meanwhile, moved among the younger men, correcting footwork, checking guards, but his eyes kept drifting back to Isaiah, a flicker of something like hope sparking in their depths, because in the old man's steady presence, he saw a glimpse of what the gym had once been about: discipline, respect, and the quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of learning. At the end of the session, when the last of the bags had gone still and the ring was empty, Rick called the fighters to gather around, his voice low but firm. "Next Friday, we're not just showing off for the cameras or the community," he said. "We're showing what it means to fight with honor, to stand in that ring and face yourself as much as your opponent." And as he spoke, Isaiah leaned against the ropes, his cane resting nearby, his presence a living testament to the truth of those words. Outside, the winter wind howled against the old brick walls, but inside the gym, there was a warmth, a flicker of something that felt like purpose. And as Isaiah gathered his things and made his way to the door, he paused, glancing back at the ring one last time, and in that silent moment, he felt the echo of every round he had ever fought, every lesson he had ever learned, and he knew that when the bell rang next Friday, he would not be stepping into the past. He would be stepping into the truth of who he had always been. In the days that followed, the gym became a crucible of noise and sweat and restless energy, the young fighters throwing themselves into their training with a newfound intensity, as if by pushing their bodies to the breaking point, they could silence the questions that Isaiah's presence had stirred in them, and all the while, the old man moved through it like a quiet current beneath the surface, his steps measured, his breath steady, never seeking the spotlight, but never shrinking from it either. Maya watched him more closely than ever, studying the subtle angles of his footwork, the way he turned his shoulder just enough to slip a punch, the calm that radiated from him like an invisible shield. And in the quiet moments between rounds, she found herself asking questions she hadn't dared to before, about balance, about fear, about the way the world outside the ring seemed to melt away when the gloves were on. Isaiah answered her with the same patient honesty he brought to every movement. His words never flashy, never loud, but each one landing with the weight of someone who had lived every lesson he spoke. And for the first time in years, Maya felt the tight knot of doubt in her chest begin to loosen. Ethan, meanwhile, watched with a scowl that deepened each day, his pride smarting at the way the others had begun to nod when Isaiah spoke, the way Rick had started to incorporate some of the old man's drills into their workouts. And though he trained harder than ever, each punch he threw seemed to carry a question he couldn't answer. Why did the old man's calm seem to hold more power than his own aggression? And why did it bother him so much? One evening, after the others had left and the ring lights cast long shadows across the worn canvas, Ethan approached Isaiah as he worked the speed bag, his voice low and tight. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, the words more accusation than question. And Isaiah paused, his eyes meeting Ethan's without a hint of fear. "I think I'm older than you," he said quietly, "and I think I've learned that it's not about being better than anyone else. It's about being better than you were yesterday." And the simplicity of the words cut through Ethan's anger like a blade, leaving him standing there with his fists clenched and nothing to say. That night, as Isaiah walked home beneath the flickering streetlights, he felt the cold bite of winter on his cheeks. But inside, there was a warmth that came not from the furnace of youth, but from the steady fire of a purpose reclaimed. And he knew that when he stepped into the ring for the exhibition match, it would not be a fight against the years or the doubts of others, but a fight for the part of himself that had never stopped believing that the measure of a man was not in his victories, but in his willingness to stand back up, again and again, no matter how many times life tried to knock him down. The night before the exhibition match, the gym was quiet, the bag still and the ring empty, and Isaiah stood in the center of it all, his breath misting in the cold air, the soft hum of the city beyond the windows, a distant murmur that seemed to fade beneath the pounding of his own heart. He had wrapped his hands the way he always had, each loop of cloth a ritual, a promise to himself that no matter what came tomorrow, he would meet it with the same quiet dignity he had carried all these years. In the shadows of the empty gym, he could almost hear the echoes of every fighter who had come before him, the whisper of gloves on canvas, the crackle of leather striking leather, and he let those sounds wash over him, a benediction of the life he had chosen. At home, he laid out his gear for the morning, the old gloves that had been with him since Detroit, the mouthguard he hadn't worn in decades, each piece a memory, a testament to the battles he had fought and the lessons he had learned. He slept little that night, the quiet of the apartment broken only by the soft sigh of the wind at the window. And when dawn broke cold and gray, he rose with the same calm that had carried him through every round, every storm. The gym was already buzzing when he arrived, the ring lit like a stage, the bleachers packed with faces. Some curious, some skeptical, some hungry for the spectacle they expected. Rick met him at the door, his expression sober, but his eyes alight with something like pride, and he clapped Isaiah on the shoulder with a quiet respect that needed no words. Maya stood nearby, her gloves slung around her neck, and when she caught Isaiah's eye, she offered a small, tight smile, the kind that said she understood what he was about to do. Ethan and Cole lingered at the edge of the crowd, their expressions tight, the weight of the coming match heavy on their shoulders. But it was Ethan who stepped forward first, his voice low but steady. "Good luck, old man," he said. And though the words were gruff, there was no mistaking the respect in his tone, and Isaiah nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge they were building between them. One brick at a time, as the crowd settled and the bell rang out, the noise fell away, and for a moment there was nothing but the ring, the ropes, the quiet promise of what was about to begin. Isaiah stepped forward, his cane left behind, his back straight and his eyes clear, and in that moment he felt the years fall away, not erased, but woven into every breath, every heartbeat, every inch of the ring beneath his feet. He knew that what he carried into the ring today was not the arrogance of youth or the need to prove himself to anyone else, but the quiet conviction that there was no shame in the struggle, no dishonor in the effort, and that sometimes the truest victory was simply to stand and fight. No matter how long the odds, no matter how heavy the years. The bell rang and the ring became a world unto itself. The cheers and camera flashes from the crowd fading into a distant roar as Isaiah stepped forward, his breath steady and his movements deliberate. And across from him stood Cole, his young face set in a mask of concentration, the sweat already beating on his forehead as he shifted from foot to foot like a coiled spring. And for a moment, time seemed to stretch out between them. The decades of experience and the raw fire of youth balanced on the edge of every breath. Rick stood just outside the ropes, his hands gripping the top strand as he watched with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He knew this was not just an exhibition, not just a show for the curious and the bored, but a moment of truth, a test of spirit that went beyond age or rank. Isaiah moved first, his feet sliding across the canvas in a careful rhythm that spoke of decades of quiet discipline. Each step measured, each breath controlled, and when Cole lunged forward with a quick jab, Isaiah slipped to the side, the punch skimming past his shoulder without ever touching him. And in that movement was the lesson he had carried all these years. That fighting was not about force, but about understanding the spaces between the punches, the silent beat where the world paused and gave you room to breathe. Cole came again, faster this time, his frustration bleeding into every motion, and Isaiah felt the thump of the younger man's gloves against his arms, the weight of youth and pride and unspoken questions driving each blow. But he did not flinch, did not falter. He absorbed the force, his body a bridge rather than a wall, his movements a quiet conversation with the violence that danced so close to his bones. For a moment, Cole's eyes met his, and in that brief flicker of contact, Isaiah saw the doubt there. The question that every fighter asked when the reality of the ring pressed close. Am I enough? And in that heartbeat of recognition, Isaiah gave him his answer, not in words, but in the calm of his gaze, the certainty of every line on his face that said, I am still here, and so are you. The bell rang again, ending the first round, and as Cole stepped back, his shoulders heaving, Isaiah raised his gloves in a quiet salute, a gesture that carried no triumph, no boast, only respect for the boy who stood across from him, and the promise that he would give him the fight he had come for. The crowd erupted, their cheers rolling over the ring like a tide, but for Isaiah, there was only the soft sound of his own breath, the slow thunder of his heart, and the quiet certainty that the truest measure of a man was not in how many times he won, but in how many times he found the strength to stand back up, no matter how long the years had tried to teach him to stay down. The second round began with a new rhythm, a faster beat to the footwork, the hush of the crowd giving way to the low hum of anticipation that filled the air like a held breath. And Cole came at him with everything he had, the flush of embarrassment from the first round still hot on his cheeks, his fists snapping out in sharp bursts that spoke of youth and the need to prove that he still belonged in the same ring as the old man who moved with the calm of a winter river, unhurried and unstoppable. Each punch from Cole carried the force of a question, and each slip from Isaiah carried the patience of a lifetime spent answering it, his body moving with a grace that defied the years. A quiet economy of motion that turned each step, each shift of his weight into a story of resilience. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes locked on the ring, the lines of worry on Rick's face mirrored by the slight furrow in Maya's brow as she watched. Her own gloves clutched tight against her chest, as if to hold in the breath she didn't dare to release. Cole's frustration grew with every exchange, the sweat shining on his face as he realized that Isaiah was not here to be beaten, that no matter how many times he tried to find an opening, the old man's guard was a wall he couldn't break through. And with every failed combination, Cole's movements grew more ragged, the sharp edges of his aggression blunted by the calm, deliberate defense that Isaiah offered in answer to every wild punch. Then, in a moment that seemed to hang suspended in the breathless air, Isaiah shifted his weight, his body pivoting with the slow inevitability of the tide, and his right hand came forward in a single, measured punch that caught Cole's shoulder, not with the force to hurt him, but with the weight of every lesson the old man had ever learned, every moment he had ever spent in the ring. And the contact was enough to stop Cole's advance in its tracks, to make him pause, his eyes wide with the shock of it. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, the ring holding its breath along with the crowd, And in that silence, Isaiah lowered his gloves just enough to let Cole see his face. The calm there, the forgiveness, the quiet understanding that this was not about winning or losing, but about learning what it meant to stand in the ring and face yourself. The bell rang, ending the round, and Cole stepped back, his shoulders slumping as he nodded once, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any punch he had thrown. Isaiah stood in the center of the ring, his breath steady, his eyes clear. And in that moment, every person watching knew that they were witnessing something more than a fight. They were witnessing a man who had become more than the sum of his battles, a man who carried the weight of his years, not as a burden, but as a crown. The final round arrived with the hush of inevitability, the buzz of the crowd thinning into a reverent quiet as both men stepped forward, their movements careful, deliberate, and for a moment the years seemed to stretch and bend, the light of the overhead bulbs glinting off the sweat on their faces, like a reminder that the ring was not just a place of violence, but of truth, of the simple honesty that came from standing toe to toe and refusing to yield. Isaiah felt the weight of every breath, the slow, steady thud of his heartbeat, like a drum in his chest. But there was no fear there, only the quiet focus that had always carried him through every round, every storm. Cole's eyes were different now, the brash defiance of youth replaced by a kind of respect, a flicker of understanding that this was no longer about proving himself to the world, but about proving to himself that he could rise and stand in the presence of something older and truer than he had ever known. Their gloves touched once in a brief silent salute, and then the dance began again, each man moving in the narrow space of the ring like echoes of the same story, 2 chapters of a history written in sweat and sacrifice. Cole's punches were still fast, still sharp, but the wildness was gone, replaced by a measured precision that spoke of lessons learned, of the quiet mentorship that had been offered without words by the man who had shown him that strength was more than power, that it was also restraint. Isaiah, for his part, moved with the ease of memory, each step a testament to the decades that had shaped him, each breath a prayer of gratitude for the chance to feel the weight of the gloves again, to hear the hiss of the ropes as they shifted with every movement. In the final exchange, Cole came forward with a flurry of punches, his fists a blur of youthful energy, but Isaiah slipped each one with the calm certainty of the tide, his counterpunch a simple, gentle tap against Cole's shoulder, a gesture that said, "Not yet, not now," and in that instant, Cole understood that there were some battles that could only be fought in the quiet spaces between the fists, in the silence that followed the final bell. When that bell rang, the crowd erupted, but Isaiah heard none of it, his breath slow and deep, his eyes meeting Cole's one last time in a look that carried no triumph, no gloating, only the quiet respect of one fighter to another. And as they lowered their gloves, the world seemed to settle around them, the weight of the years and the sweat and the struggle all finding their place in the quiet between them. And in that silence, the ring was not just a ring, it was a place of belonging, of forgiveness, of the simple truth that some fights were never about the other man, but about the battle within. The crowd's applause faded into the soft hum of conversation as people began to file out, the murmur of excitement and disbelief swirling around the edges of the ring like a gentle tide. But inside the ropes, Isaiah stood in the quiet aftermath of the final bell, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths, the sweat cooling on his skin, each drop a testament to the years that had brought him to this moment. Rick stepped forward, his face a careful mask of professionalism that couldn't quite hide the gleam of pride in his eyes, and he clasped Isaiah's hand in a grip that spoke louder than any words, the warmth of it a silent acknowledgement of everything they both understood, that what had just happened in the ring was more than an exhibition, more than a show for curious onlookers. It was a reclamation, a declaration that no matter how many years lay behind him, Isaiah's spirit was still as sharp and bright as ever. Cole stood nearby, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but his eyes alight with something new, a spark of humility, of respect, of the quiet knowledge that he had just shared the ring with a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone, but had still given everything he had to the final round. Maya approached from the sidelines, her gloves tucked under her arm, and she smiled at Isaiah with a warmth that seemed to fill the air around them. "You showed them, old man," she said softly, her voice filled with a wonder that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with heart. And Isaiah chuckled, the sound low and rough in his chest. "I didn't need to show them anything," he replied. "I just needed to remind myself that I still could." And in that simple truth, she saw the heart of everything he had tried to teach her. That the greatest fight was never about winning, but about showing up, about refusing to be silenced by doubt or fear. As they packed up their gear and the gym lights dimmed, Isaiah lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over the ring, the worn ropes and battered canvas glowing softly in the last of the fluorescent light, and he felt the echoes of every round he had ever fought, every lesson learned in blood and breath and sweat, and he knew that tomorrow the world would go on. The crowds would find new things to cheer for, the young fighters would chase new victories, but for tonight he had found what he had come for, the quiet certainty that though the years had carved their lines into his face, they had not dulled the fire in his soul. The next morning dawned with a pale winter light that streamed through the cracked windows of the Iron Fist Boxing Club, and Isaiah was already there, his breath fogging in the chill of the unheated gym, the steady rhythm of his shadow boxing a silent testament to the lesson that had always carried him forward, that the work never ends, even when the fight is over. The young fighters trickled in one by one, their voices hushed in the presence of the old man who had turned the ring into a place of quiet reverence. And though Ethan still carried the tight line of pride in his jaw, there was a different weight in his eyes when he nodded at Isaiah, a silent acknowledgement that respect need not be spoken to be real. Rick watched from the office doorway, the faintest smile playing at the corners of his lips as he saw how the mood of the gym had shifted, the old rivalries tempered by something deeper, something that felt like understanding. And he knew that in the gentle rhythm of Isaiah's movements, there was a lesson for all of them, that there was more to this place than fists and footwork, more to each of them than the trophies they chased. Maya moved closer, her gloves slung over her shoulder, and she studied Isaiah with a quiet intensity that was no longer curiosity, but something closer to devotion. "Teach me," she said softly. And Isaiah paused, his breath slow and even as he looked at her with the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that the truest strength was not in the fists, but in the willingness to keep moving forward, no matter the weight of the years. He nodded once, a simple gesture that carried with it the promise of 1,000 unspoken lessons. And in that moment, the dusty old gym felt like a sacred place, the battered ring no longer just a square of canvas and ropes, but a temple of sweat and will, a place where the past and the present could meet in the quiet beat of a heart that refused to stop fighting. Outside, the cold wind howled against the walls, but inside, there was only the steady echo of breath and the soft shuffle of feet on wood. And in that simple sound was the reminder that no matter how long the years might stretch, no matter how heavy the world might feel, there would always be a place for those who chose to keep rising again and again in the quiet defiance of those who knew that the fight is never truly over. The days that followed the exhibition match were marked by a quiet transformation within the Iron Fist Boxing Club, a shift in the air that was almost imperceptible, but as real as the steady rhythm of a well-thrown jab, and Isaiah felt it in the way the young fighters moved around him, their punches a little more precise, their footwork a little more measured, as if the memory of that final round had seeped into the bones of the gym itself. Ethan was the first to approach him again, the usual smirk replaced by a thoughtful frown, as he watched Isaiah wrap his hands with the same patient ritual he had always used. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Teach me that," he said, nodding toward the slow, deliberate rap that had become a symbol of something larger than technique. And Isaiah smiled, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he showed Ethan how to turn the cloth not just into protection for the knuckles, but into a promise to oneself to honor the work, the history, the quiet dignity of the fight. In those small lessons, the gym began to breathe again, the usual thud of gloves against bags layered with something softer, something that felt like reverence for the sweat-soaked echoes of the past. Maya, too, found her rhythm shifting, her movements no longer driven by the frantic need to prove herself, but by the quiet hunger to understand, to feel the weight of each breath and the meaning of each slip and pivot. And in those moments when the gym fell silent, when the winter wind howled outside and the only sound was the whisper of the gloves on canvas, Isaiah could feel the years drop away, leaving behind only the pulse of his heart and the simple truth that had carried him through every storm. This was where he belonged, not in the victories of the past, or the trophies gathering dust in some forgotten corner, but in the gentle patience of teaching, the soft strength of showing a younger fighter how to find their own breath in the middle of the chaos. And as the days bled into one another, the quiet strength of the old man in the corner became a kind of compass for the restless souls around him, a reminder that though the ring would always belong to the young, it would always have a place for those who knew that the truest measure of a fighter was not in how they entered the ring, but in how they chose to leave it, with dignity, with grace, and with the unbreakable promise to stand and rise again, no matter how many times the world tried to teach them to stay down. As winter deepened and the city streets grew slick with ice, the Iron Fist Boxing Club became a sanctuary of warmth and motion, the air inside thick with the scent of sweat and the soft thunder of gloves meeting heavy bags. And in that rhythm, Isaiah found a comfort he had long thought lost, each day beginning with the quiet scrape of his cane on the wooden floor, and ending with the steady echo of breath and discipline that reminded him of who he was and who he would always be. The exhibition match had faded into the past, but its memory remained in the way the young fighters trained, their punches tempered by something softer, something more thoughtful, as if the ghost of that final round still hovered above the ring, whispering lessons about patience and purpose and the kind of strength that could not be measured in trophies or titles. Ethan no longer barked orders or threw punches with reckless abandon, his movements growing deliberate, his gaze steadier as he watched Isaiah work the pads with Maya, the soft thud of her gloves punctuating the quiet cadence of her breath. And in those small moments, a silent promise passed between them, a promise that the fight was not just about power, but about the quiet conversation between mind and muscle, spirit and sweat. Rick watched from the shadows, the faintest smile playing at the edges of his lips as he saw the way the old man's lessons had sunk roots into the cracked floorboards of the gym, the way even the youngest fighter paused to listen when Isaiah spoke, his voice low and calm and carrying the weight of every round he had ever fought. And in the hush of those mornings, when the world outside was lost in the icy fog and the only light came from the flickering bulbs overhead, Isaiah felt the years slip from his shoulders, each breath a quiet act of defiance against the slow creep of time. And he knew that though the ring would one day fall silent, though the echo of gloves on canvas would one day fade, for now, in this place, in this moment, the fight still lived in every breath he took, and that was enough to carry him forward, one quiet step at a time. In the final days of winter, as the first hints of spring began to thaw the icy edges of the city, the Iron Fist Boxing Club pulsed with a quiet energy that felt like promise, like the slow bloom of something new and yet ancient. And Isaiah felt it in the way the young fighters moved around him, their steps more certain, their breath steadier, each one carrying a flicker of the lesson he had brought back into the ring that night. Maya's punches found a new rhythm, her footwork more sure, and when she looked at him across the ring, there was no longer a question in her eyes, but a quiet determination that spoke of someone who had learned not just how to fight, but how to keep rising. Ethan's shoulders had lost their stiff pride, his gaze meeting Isaiah's with a respect that went beyond words, and in the moments between rounds, he found himself asking questions that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with the quiet resolve that had carried the old man through every storm. Rick, too, found a new purpose in the soft clink of the speed bag, the crisp snap of jump ropes against the floor, his voice softer but his presence stronger, the weight of the years and the doubts and the endless noise of the world outside falling away in the hush of the gym. And Isaiah, standing in the corner as the sun spilled through the high windows in thin golden stripes, felt a peace that had nothing to do with the fights he had won or lost, a peace that came from knowing that the final bell was not an end, but a beginning, that the greatest victory was not in the crowd's applause, but in the quiet conviction of the breath that followed, the small, steady promise to stand again tomorrow. He left the gym that night with his cane tapping out a slow rhythm on the cracked sidewalk, the cold air sharp against his cheeks, and he carried with him the echo of the gloves on canvas, the hush of breath and focus that had become his refuge and his redemption. And as he turned the corner onto his street, the city lights glinting in the distance like distant stars, he knew that though the years would keep coming and the weight of them would press against his bones, there would always be a place in this world for those who chose to fight, not for the glory of the crowd or the trophies gathering dust, but for the quiet, unshakable truth that lived in the spaces between each breath, each step, each heartbeat. A truth that said the fight was never truly over, as long as you were willing to stand and begin again. As the echoes of that final round faded into the quiet, the old man stood beneath the flickering gym lights, his breath slow and measured, and in the hush that followed, every person watching knew they had witnessed something more than a fight. They had seen a testament to the power of the human spirit, the quiet dignity of never giving up, no matter how long the years may stretch. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own story of resilience. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chance to witness the quiet courage that can change everything. See you in the next story.